Hello, and welcome to the Immigrant Sales Voices podcast. I'm Julia, your host, and I'm here to share inspiring stories of immigrants in tech sales in the US. By sharing their journeys and insights, we hope to empower others aspiring to break into this industry. I'm excited to hear from our next guest about their success in the highly competitive world of sales. Today, we're joined by Konstantin Dubovitskiy. Konstantin is a senior account executive at Checkbook and has previously worked at Firstbase. He's also the founder and host of Fundraising Radio, the world's largest podcast dedicated to fundraising for early-stage startups in the US. Hi, Konstantin, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Julia. Thanks for the invitation here. Glad to be here.
Of course. Thank you. Can you please provide some background about yourself? Where did you immigrate from?
Sure. I moved here to the States from Russia, Moscow, about 9 years ago. It's been a while.
And how did you get started in the sales industry here?
The story there is actually pretty cool. I started with economics. That was my prime interest. And then my brother once was going to a hackathon, and his partner got sick. And he was like, hey, I got an extra ticket. You want to go with me? So I went, stuck around there, helped him do the presentation, and there was an investor in the audience, and he's like, I love this, brother duo. One is doing business, one is doing tech/coding, which was my brother. I'm going to invest in you guys. Just build this company to XYZ, and I'll give you $100,000. At the time, I was, I think, 15, 16 years old. I'm like, hell yeah, we're doing this. Absolutely, I'm in. And that's kind of how I got lured into the sales, because my brother didn't want to do it. So I want to meet.
So, since we both are immigrants, I want to ask the question about the language. So how did you go about learning English? And did you face any particular challenges in becoming fluent?
Sure did. When I moved, I already had some English. It was definitely not fluent by any stretch of imagination, plus could barely understand accents. And people in high schools here used quite a bit of slang. So that was definitely a challenge. For me, honestly, the breakthrough was that, if you can see the poster there, it's Michael Scott from The Office, for people who are familiar. That was the big breakthrough for me. Essentially, what happened there is I was watching movies, or I always watched a lot of movies. I always watched them in Russian. And this show, I loved it, but the second season didn't have a translation into Russian. So I had to watch it in English, and that's when I got on a journey of watching a shitload of movies and shows in English. So I'd say that was the breakthrough for me personally.
That's a cool hack. Thank you.
Yeah, it works. It works. That's how I encourage most people to learn English, honestly.
So what were some of the challenges that you faced as an immigrant entering the sales profession?
Standard procedures, no connections, no real skills in that space. Had to relearn English, obviously, to be more in a communication stage, and it had to be free flowing essentially. Otherwise, nothing gets sold. And for the longest time, the issue was the accent, or like my accent was just too thick. Some Americans were struggling with it. Some Americans were like, "Oh, the fuck is that?"
How did you approach your first tech sales job search in the US? What process and strategies did you use to find these opportunities?
So again, the first positions were at my own company, so that was an easy hire. I just had to hire myself essentially. From that point on, I used that. So I've met some people through meetups. Great spot to meet people, especially if you're going into the early stage startups. So that's definitely a place I'd recommend you to look. If you live in big tech cities or in cities with population of, at least 100,000 people, there's bound to be some technical meetups for startup founders. So go there. That's a good first spot. And my first position was obviously, at my own startups. And when I decided to move on from trying to build something of my own, I worked at a fund. And the way I found that position was actually through my podcast. I can elaborate on that in a bit if you're curious.
Could you please also share some memorable stories from your job interviews, if you have some?
Sure. I'd say the most memorable one would be my early interviews when I was still figuring out how to actually work in the States. And I got invited to a handful of positions that were like life insurance or something along those lines, which is basically a pyramid scheme or something very close to it, which targets immigrants, low income people, so essentially marginalized people. And on the first interview, I'm like, oh shit, that's a scam. So I had a few of those horrendous experience. And the other one I'd say was some telemarketing company or something like that, where I did not get a job because they told me that my accent is too thick. I'm like, oh, cool. At the time, I did not know that it's illegal to say that. So I'm like, oh, well, shit. All right, I guess I'll search for something else then. But yeah, those fun times.
Yeah, and this is very important note about the accent.
Yeah, absolutely. They're definitely not allowed to say that. It was a sketchy company. That's why they were so bluntly obvious. In reality, most likely what's going to happen if you have an actual thick accent, they're going to tell you something politically correct or something that would not land them in a lawsuit, which would sound something like, I don't know, we require a high English proficiency or formal education in the U.S. university or something along those lines. Again, they're going to make another excuse. So just be aware of that.
What do you think were the factors that employers valued in you back then? Why did they choose you?
So the first employer that I got actual formal contract with, that was at a fund, and we've built up some relationship. So I met that investor while I was trying to build my own companies. And then when I decided to switch over to actually work at a fund, I'm like, hey, how do I do this? I essentially created a podcast to interview venture capitalists. And then after the interview, I would be like, hey, do you hire? Are you hiring? Do you have any positions open? I'm very interested in literally whatever can be thrown at me. So that's what worked. some hustling, as one can say. That definitely worked out for me. It definitely works less in the more formal space. So again, that's why I stuck with startups, because it's just easier to wiggle your way by being a bit creative. When it comes to more corporate positions, formal education definitely on top, and the background. So again, anything that you can put on your resume, that's what they value.
Yeah, sure. And how did you move to Firstbase?
Firstbase, I moved there after I worked for the venture fund for a while. At a venture fund, unfortunately, I did burn out, so I worked there for about almost 2 years, I think. Loved it, still in great relationship with my old boss, but just worked a little bit too hard. Did not listen to his advice on taking a vacation, and decided that it's time for me to move on, get an actual formal position where I could say hey, this is when I joined. Here's what I've done. Here's the X amount of growth that we've seen in the past year or so. So yeah, that's how I got into Firstbase. I applied to a bunch of Y Combinator sponsored companies and got into the YC, or got into Firstbase. YC
What about your current role? Could you please provide some description? What are your day-to-day responsibilities? What is the product or service that you currently sell, and who are your primary customers?
Sure, that's a lot of questions in one question. So I'll try to keep it all in mind, but my memory is flaky as hell. So first answer would be, I'm currently a senior account executive at Checkbook.io. One-liner for Checkbook.io, it is a platform that allows you to send payments or invoices to anyone, knowing just their name and email address. So usually, you have to collect their banking information. You have to reach out to them and be like, hey, is PayPal okay for you? Is Venmo okay for you? Then you have to collect the handle. In our case, all those problems are gone, essentially. We allow you to send electronic checks to those people. That's the first answer. My day-to-day looks very different. Mostly it's just a bunch of meetings with prospects, with customers that we already have existing relationship with, and they are considering upgrading. Saying out contracts, negotiating on the contracts, and helping them on board. So today I spent most of the day in a bunch of meetings. Then an hour ago, send out the contracts, and then 30 minutes later they signed it. So then I had to connect them to our customer support team, make sure that our HubSpot records are clean, pass them on, moving on with my life. Now I'm doing this.
Cool.
And answering the last question, which is, who is our prime customer? Literally anyone who is making payments above, I'd say, 50 payments per month is who we target, but we don't have like an ideal customer profile per se.
But at least it's B2B sales, right?
Yeah, it is B2B.
Okay.
I do not do direct to consumer. Not my thing.
Can you please share a specific success story or achievement in your sales career that you were particularly proud of?
I'd say my initial position at the fund, like at Make Studios, the greatest success was that I could find any limited partners to invest in our fund as a 18-year-old at the time, I think, or 19, something like that. So young with no connections whatsoever. And the fact that I could find someone who actually invested, I think the first check we got was $50,000. That was an epic win. Definitely the proudest moment of my career so far, or the most impressive. If I would look back at myself being 18-year-old, I'd be like, nah, you can't do that. Yeah, I did, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, of course. Did your cultural background influence your sales approach in any way? And maybe there are some unique perspectives that that you bring to the table, or I don't know. Did you encounter any cultural differences at all with your sales career?
100%. First of all, I had to work a lot on smiling more. So Russians or Eastern Europeans in general are just notorious for just having this blank expression on their face, and many Americans just view it as hostile, or they feel like we're not really enjoying the conversation. Meanwhile, we're pretty happy, So I had to work on that quite a bit. And besides that, honestly, not much difference. Just unique perspective, I'd say, is skepticism. So I've learned quite fast to disregard a lot of the bullshit talk that I can hear. When the prospect is telling you like, yeah, we're loving this, but for a fact that this person who's talking to you right now is not an actual decision maker, you're like, all right, this really does not matter unless the decision maker says XYZ. We have the timeline, we have the budget, all that is set. Nothing's going to happen. So again, short answer would be obviously some cultural differences. You adjust. Takes a few years.
And did you face any discrimination or bias due to your immigrant status?
No, absolutely not. That's the beauty of the States. No one really cares. Most people actually genuinely like my Russian accent, so I'm still maintaining some. Like, I'm not working on removing it whatsoever. I actually hope that it stays there forever, because it's just like a fun, quirky thing that most Americans do like. Yeah, like I've had a few times when some homeless people were yelling at me and my brother when we were like talking in Russian in the street. We got yelled at a few times, like, get back on the boat, but they're mentally unstable, so not going to take that seriously. Other than that, smooth sailing, pun intended.
Perfect. And again, reflecting on your early job search experience here in the US, what advice would you offer to your past self to make the process smoother and easier?
That's a good question. I'd say go directly into startups. That's the good solution. All starting positions are hardcore. They're horrible, god awful positions, especially in sales. Most likely you're going to be doing SDR position, which is sales development representative. Most of that position is cold calling, emailing, and getting yelled at. So whatever you do, most likely is going to be a god awful position. So good luck with that. When it comes to switching, I'd say reach out to startup founders. Usually it's kind of easy to find their contact information. They're usually more open to conversations. And even if you have no background in sales, if you just show that you're willing to put work into it, it can be done very easily by simply reaching out to the founders. It's much easier to secure the positions, and that can, if you hatch your wagon to a good startup, you're gonna skyrocket with them. So that's my advice: go for startups.
Yeah, and so do you recommend using LinkedIn for that, or any other channels?
That's a good question. I'd say LinkedIn is one of my least favorite tools. The tools that I would recommend is AngelList. I think now it's called WellFund or something like that.
Well-found. Yeah.
Well-found. Yeah. They rebranded recently. Hate it, but whatever. So use Well Found and YC Jobs. Those are the two sites that I use the most. If those don't work for you, just literally Google jobs at startups. Something's going to pop up. There are a handful of other tools out there that provides connections between early stage people and early stage startups. So honestly, not too complicated to get an intro into a startup.
Great advice. Yeah. And so could you recommend any resources, communities, or organizations that were helpful during your job search and career development? Something maybe you still use to this day?
Well Found and YC Jobs, still use it to this day. That's how I found Checkbook.io, for example. So the way I found them is discovered the position on Well Found, found the recruiter for this specific role, emailed her, got a job like 2-3 weeks later, something like that. So that strategy still works absolutely perfectly. And I actually wrote an article on how I search for my positions. It's pretty straightforward reach out process, but still covers some of the tools that I personally use, like on a daily basis, to find contact information on recruiters, to find who's actually in charge of hiring for the positions, and so on and so forth. So I'll definitely share the link afterwards.
Perfect. Maybe you have something to recommend regarding the career development as well. Maybe some useful resources.
Practice. It all comes from positions. I have not. Again, I'm a big avid reader. Initially, obviously, I tried to learn a lot from books. It does not work. That's the short answer. Books, when it comes to sales, they are not particularly useful because it heavily depends, or the sales approach heavily depends on the specific position, on the industry, on the ideal customer profile that you're targeting, and so on and so forth. Plus the team structure. So there are so many variables. It's literally impossible to prepare for them. So I'd say practice. Start with a startup. Get into it. Make a shitload of mistakes in the beginning. You learn on the fly. That's the goal, basically. So when it comes to resources, my recommendation is Google a few books. Sure, start somewhere, and then get a job. That's it. Learn on the job.
Yeah. And in your career, did you have any mentors or role models who impacted your your success?
Not exactly. So yeah, I learned most of it on the job with all right, you know what, never mind, I take it back. It's the founder of Make It Capital, that I worked for about almost 2 years. That was my basically only mentor at the time, and up to this date. I'd say taught me quite a bit. He helped me quite a bit, with the exploration process. He was the big believer of just getting your hands dirty, learning on the fly, and then moving on from there, instead of trying to learn at the comfort of your home with the way of failing, basically. So again, he was the one who taught me this process of failing and reiterating and then trying again. So yeah, I'd say that he's the guy. He's the man.
Cool. Yeah. Do you follow any particular sales influencers on LinkedIn?
No. They post a lot of bullshit and a lot of vague advice. I did not listen to that.
Cool. Good to know. What advice would you give to other immigrants currently seeking sales positions in the US?
It depends on where they are in their lifestyle or life journey. I forgot the word there for a sec. So that does still happen, even though I've been around for 9 years. Again, it depends on where they are in their life journey. From your experience, what's the most common situation for the listeners? Is that they just moved to the United States? Are they proficient in English? Do they have an education here in the States? Is it back from Europe somewhere? What's the common theme?
I think that they are early in their career here and moved recently, maybe less than 3 years ago, still struggling with learning English. And I think this kind of situation.
Shit's gonna be rough. that's my summary. My standard advice is, again, go for startups. They're the most tolerable ones to immigrants because Frequently, founders are immigrants themselves. So try to find founders who are either speaking your language, and that can be done once again through YC Well Found, potentially LinkedIn. So you can search people based on LinkedIn based on the language that they're speaking. That's an option. And just try to stick with them. Most likely your story is going to resonate with them much better than with some random American who has never dealt with the process of immigration. Another thing I'd ask is when you find a position, find the person who is who is in charge of hiring for that position, and find if you have any connections with that person. If you do, reach out to them, ask for introductions, ask for referrals. That tends to work quite a bit. But yeah, all in all, my standard advice is go for startups. The smaller, the better. If it's under 10 people, they're far more likely to take more risks on people who are, not exactly the standard kind of salesperson or sales persona. And, that can work out pretty good for you in the long run.
Yeah, good advice. I would also recommend checking their funding stage at Crunchbase. If they're funded, most probably you will stay there for, I don't know, at least a year, maybe. If they got their funding long ago, I don't think that it might be a great opportunity to join them and then realize that they run out of money. What do you think about it?
I've never had a situation where a company fully runs out of money. Obviously, when you work at startups, there's always a risk of downsizing through that. If you're good at what you're doing, I doubt that you're going to get downsized. Usually, if it's a small team, you figure out pretty early where they are when it comes to cash. Again, if you want to do extra due diligence process, sure, go for it. Crunchbase, great source. The things you live for, mentioning that because I completely forgot about it. But again, I say don't scrutinize too much. When I was early on in my job search, I didn't really have the luxury of selecting who I'm going to be working with. It's just whoever gave me the job offer. I'll be like, hell yeah, I've been looking for months at this point. Please take me in. So yeah, if you want to scrutinize a little bit more, go for it. I'd recommend take whatever comes your way and keep searching if you're not happy. Otherwise, might lose a good opportunity there.
You've mentioned that you've been, applying a lot, I presume. What were the stats?
I don't remember, honestly, at this point. I've applied to standard positions, so I've gone the standard route of going through Indeed. I've applied to a bunch of positions there. I've applied to hundreds of positions on LinkedIn. Didn't hear back from any of them. So the standard process there was applied. It did not work, so I switched up. But yeah, the stats would be hundreds and hundreds of applications back there.
Yeah. I guess everyone needs to go through that at the beginning.
Not necessarily, right? No. Again, I do think that the strategy that I've outlined with the research of the founders or hiring managers and then follow up with them via email greatly increases your response rates. It's just a huge boost to the amount of the actual interviews that you get. So I'd recommend do not go with the flow of spray and pray where you just apply to every position on Indeed that comes your way. That's just a very tedious, sad, and boring process that no one wants to do.
Yeah. And do you think that you did some mistakes in your resume early in your job search?
Good question. I do not remember my early resume, to be honest with you. I'm sure I did. I remember clearly up to this date that the first time that I had to go to this interview in person, I had to print out my resume. I had to send it to my brother because I didn't have a printer. And my brother was like, do you realize that you spelled education wrong? Like the column of education in my resume was misspelled. So simple advice would be proofread it with someone. And for early stages, I'd say lie a lot on your resume. Fuck it, lie. If you don't have enough backgrounds, add a few years. It's fine. If you can, bullshit your way through it during the interview, that's fine. That's okay. You're going to learn on the job. As long as you get it, you're good to go. Just be ready for some hardcore, especially if you're going into this early sales cycle or the top of the funnel sales cycle. It's going to be hard regardless of how much experience you got. So, if I would be thrown in right now as an SDR, I'd struggle as much as I did back in the days. So be prepared for that. I'm going to add that I'm going to follow up with Yulia here and send her the link to the article that I mentioned earlier. I do like to, be very specific with my advice, provide some specific resources. So hopefully, I did do that today and would have some help with Yulia. But other than that, again, stay strong, keep your head up. Just do know that it's going to take multiple years for you to get into the whole sales flow, especially if you're after 20 years old. It's going to be rough. It's going to be rough for sure. But yeah, it tends to work out if you don't give up. So stay strong.
Thank you. By the way, is your company currently hiring for any SDR roles?
That's a good question. Yes, we kind of are not. That's another thing about hiring in the States. Very frequently, companies will put out that they're hiring for a position. Reality is they're not. Technically speaking, we are hiring. So again, if you're listening to this, of course, please reach out to me. I'll do the first round of interviews. And if you are an interested candidate, of course, I'm going to push you up in the chain. Most companies do passively look for people to join their team. So if you can impress them with something, definitely apply. Same with our situation, check out checkbook.io. We have a handful of positions open. So definitely apply, reach out to me. I'll be happy to help you out there.
Cool. Go for it.
Yeah. Nepotism or semi-nepotism.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Konstantin, for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for sharing all this valuable advice with us today. And yeah, I will add the links that we discussed today to the description section. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Sweet. Hopefully that will help.
Yeah, of course it will. Thank you. If you have any particular questions you'd like me to ask our next guest, feel free to write them in the comments. And please don't forget to subscribe to our channel because it's the best way to support us.